Bikers attack a black woman at a gas station, unaware that her son is Snoop Dogg. He stands up for his mother and changes their fates forever. Subscribe to the channel and share this video. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over Los Angeles, its rays cutting through the thin mist that still lingered on the streets. The hum of distant traffic filled the air, and the city, as always, was stirring to life. The neighborhood where Snoop Dogg lived was quiet at this hour, a rare moment of calm in the otherwise bustling metropolis. In the driveway of his home, Snoop leaned against his car, wiping down the already spotless windshield with a soft cloth. His mother, Beverly Tate, stepped out onto the porch carrying a small cooler and a neatly packed bag. "Don't forget these," she said, her voice warm but firm. Snoop looked up, smiling as he saw her. "I got it, Mama. You sure you're ready for this trip?" Beverly gave him a pointed look. "Boy, I've been ready since the day you were born. You think I can't handle a little road trip?" He chuckled and took the cooler from her hands, setting it gently in the back of the SUV. The car gleamed under the morning sun, its polished surface reflecting the palm trees that lined their street. "You know, it's not just a little trip," he said, closing the trunk. "We'll be out there for a couple of days. Small towns, long roads, nothing like L.A. Beverly shrugged. "I grew up in a small town, Calvin. I know how to handle myself." Snoop's smile faded for a moment. "Times are different now, Mama, and not always in a good way." She stepped closer and placed a hand on his arm. "You worry too much. That's what mothers are supposed to do, not sons. You just focus on driving and let me take care of the rest." He nodded, though the unease didn't completely leave him. He was proud of his mother's strength, the way she had raised him almost single-handedly after his father left. But the world had shown him too many reasons to be cautious, too many reminders of the dangers that still lurked for people like them. The sound of an engine starting across the street drew his attention. He glanced up to see a neighbor backing out of their driveway, but his eyes lingered for a moment on the Confederate flag decal on the truck's rear window. He felt a flicker of anger, but quickly pushed it down. This was supposed to be a peaceful trip. "Let's hit the road," he said, opening the driver's side door. Beverly settled into the passenger seat, adjusting the seatbelt as Snoop turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, smooth and steady, a comforting sound. As they pulled away from the curb, Beverly reached over and turned on the radio. Old school R&B filled the car, and for a while they simply drove, letting the music carry them down the highway. The city gradually gave way to open roads and rolling hills. The horizon stretched out before them, endless and promising. Snoop felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders, though he still glanced in the rearview mirror more often than usual. "You know," Beverly said after a while, "this reminds me of when we used to take the bus across town just to see your grandma. You were so excited every time, like it was the biggest adventure in the world." Snoop smiled at the memory. "I guess I've always liked being on the move. Never wanted to stay in one place too long." "Except now you've got the whole world watching you," she teased. "No more sneaking around and staying out late without someone noticing." He laughed. "Guess that's true, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." The conversation drifted from memories to current events. Beverly brought up the protests that had been making headlines, the stories of police brutality and racial tension. Snoop listened quietly, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You ever think about what it would have been like if things hadn't worked out for you?" she asked. He glanced at her. "All the time." She nodded, as if she already knew the answer. That's why you keep fighting, isn't it? Even when it's hard. Yeah, he said softly, because it's not just about me. They drove in silence for a while after that, the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the car. The highway stretched on, leading them deeper into unfamiliar territory. Around midday, they pulled into a small diner off the highway to grab lunch. The parking lot was half empty, and inside, the atmosphere was subdued. Snoop noticed the way some of the patrons looked at them. Not outright hostility, but curiosity mixed with something darker. Beverly ignored the stares and ordered food, chatting briefly with the waitress. Snoop stayed close to her, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong here, not completely. Back on the road, the tension lingered. Beverly tried to lighten the mood by telling stories about Snoop's childhood, but he only half listened. The farther they drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Late in the afternoon, they passed through a small town where the houses looked worn and faded, and American flags hung from nearly every porch. Snoop noticed a group of men standing outside a bar, their leather jackets marked with patches. Motorcycles were lined up along the curb, and the men's eyes followed the car as it passed. Beverly didn't seem to notice, but Snoop did. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "You okay?" Beverly asked. "Yeah," he said quickly. "Just ready to get where we're going." They drove on, leaving the town behind, but the unease stayed with him. He couldn't explain it, not yet, but something about this trip didn't feel right. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they began looking for a place to stop for the night. Snoop spotted a gas station ahead and decided to fill up before they settled in. "We'll top off the tank and find a motel," he said. Beverly nodded. "Sounds good. I'll grab us some snacks." He pulled into the station, and as the car rolled to a stop, he noticed the motorcycles parked off to the side. The same kind of bikes he'd seen earlier. His stomach tightened. "I'll be quick," Beverly said, stepping out of the car. Snoop watched her walk toward the store, his gaze flicking back to the bikes. The men were inside, he was sure of it. He took a deep breath and stepped out to pump the gas. The sun was almost gone now, and shadows stretched long across the pavement. In the distance, he heard the rumble of more engines approaching. He tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. And then he heard the raised voices coming from inside the store. His heart dropped. Without a second thought, he dropped the nozzle and ran. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the isolated gas station. The faint hum of insects filled the air, mingling with the distant echo of motorcycles growling in the background. The last rays of sunlight bounced off the chrome and leather of the bikes parked to the side of the building. Snoop Dogg stood next to the pump, the hiss of gasoline filling the tank the only sound accompanying his racing thoughts. His eyes darted toward the convenience store entrance, where his mother, Beverly, had disappeared just moments earlier. The glowing "Open" sign flickered faintly, adding to the uneasy atmosphere that hung over the scene. He glanced back at the motorcycles and the faded patches on their seats. The designs weren't entirely clear from this distance, but he didn't need to see them up close to know the kind of men they belonged to. He had seen that type before. Swaggering confidence, hard stares, and an unspoken challenge in their demeanor. The sound of voices inside the store pulled him out of his thoughts. At first, it was just murmurs, but then a sharper tone cut through. He recognized Beverly's voice, calm yet carrying an edge of firmness. Snoop's pulse quickened. He left the pump running and strode toward the store, his footsteps heavy against the concrete. The door swung open with a faint chime, and the scene inside hit him like a punch to the gut. Beverly stood near the counter, clutching a bottle of water and a bag of chips. 3 men loomed around her, their leather jackets adorned with patches that Snoop recognized now, symbols of a biker gang notorious in rural areas for their hostility toward outsiders, especially people of color. One of the men had leaned in too close, his face contorted into a sneer. "You lost, lady?" the man asked, his voice thick with disdain. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Beverly replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to pay for these and get back to my son." Snoop's presence at the door shifted the energy in the room. All 3 men turned to look at him, their expressions darkening as recognition flickered across their faces. "Well, well," one of them said, stepping back slightly but not enough to break the tension. "Look who it is. Big man from the city." Snoop ignored him and focused on Beverly. "You okay, Mama?" "I'm fine," she said, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of relief at his arrival. He stepped closer, positioning himself between her and the men. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low but firm. One of the bikers chuckled, crossing his arms. "Not so fast. You think you can just roll up in here and walk out like you own the place? This ain't L.A., boy. People around here don't take kindly to strangers." Snoop felt his muscles tense, but he kept his cool. He had dealt with worse than this before, and he wasn't about to let these men intimidate him. "We don't want any trouble," he said. "Just let us pay and go." The tallest of the 3 stepped forward, close enough for Snoop to smell the alcohol on his breath. "Trouble? Nah, man. Trouble's already here." Before Snoop could react, the man shoved him backward. Beverly gasped and the cashier behind the counter froze, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Snoop stumbled but quickly regained his balance. He saw Beverly's fear, not for herself, but for him, and it fueled his resolve. "Don't," Beverly said softly, but Snoop had already stepped forward again. "You need to back off," he said, his voice sharper now. "This ain't the time or the place." But the bikers weren't backing down. The one who had shoved him reached for something under his jacket. Maybe a knife, maybe something worse, but Snoop moved faster. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it, forcing him to drop whatever he was holding. The sound of metal hitting the floor rang out as the other 2 lunged toward him. The fight erupted in an instant. Snoop's instincts took over as he dodged a punch and drove his fist into one man's stomach. The other grabbed him from behind, but Snoop threw his weight backward, slamming them both into a shelf and sending snacks and drinks cascading to the floor. Beverly stepped back, her eyes wide but her hands steady as she pulled out her phone and started recording. "Let go of him!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The bikers hesitated, suddenly aware the phone pointed at them. "You're all on camera now," Beverly added. "Think real hard about your next move." One of the bikers cursed and shoved Snoop away before stumbling toward the door. The others followed, throwing one last glare at Beverly as they disappeared outside. Snoop exhaled sharply, his heart still racing. He turned to Beverly. "You okay?" "I told you I was fine," she said, though her hands trembled as she lowered the phone. The cashier finally found his voice. I called the cops," he stammered. "They'll be here soon." Snoop nodded, grateful but also wary. He knew how these situations could play out, even when the evidence was on his side. Outside, the sound of motorcycles revving filled the air as the bikers sped off. But Snoop didn't relax. "We're not done here," he muttered. Beverly looked at him, her eyes filled with both pride and concern. "We need to be careful, Calvin. These men, they're not going to let this go." "I know," he said, "but neither am I." The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, and Snoop squared his shoulders. The fight was far from over, and he knew this was only the beginning. The sound of sirens grew louder, their wailing echoes slicing through the tense atmosphere of the gas station parking lot. Snoop stood near the entrance, his eyes fixed on the retreating taillights of the bikers' motorcycles as they roared down the road and disappeared into the fading daylight. His fists were still clenched, his breath still heavy, but his focus had already shifted. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Beverly stepped out of the store, her phone still in hand, though now her fingers trembled slightly as she tried to steady her grip. She looked at Snoop, her expression a mix of pride and worry. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Snoop shook his head, his eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of their return. "I couldn't just stand there, Mama. They weren't going to let us walk out of here without trying something." Beverly exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping as the adrenaline began to fade. "I know, but you need to be careful. You can't fight everyone who looks at us the wrong way." "This wasn't just a look," Snoop said, his voice low but firm. "This was different, and you know it." Before Beverly could respond, the first police car rolled into the parking lot, its lights flashing but siren off now. Another followed close behind. Officers stepped out cautiously, hands resting near their belts as they assessed the situation. Snoop raised his hands slightly, already preparing himself for what might come next. "You the one who called?" one of the officers asked, his gaze shifting between Snoop and Beverly. Beverly stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I did, and I got the whole thing on video." The officers relaxed slightly, though their eyes lingered on Snoop a moment longer. "We're gonna need to see that," the first officer said. Snoop watched as Beverly handed over the phone, replaying the footage for the officers. He could see their expressions change as they watched, the initial skepticism giving way to something closer to concern. "Looks like they didn't leave you much of a choice," the officer admitted, glancing back at Snoop. "But we're still going to need statements from both of you." The next hour passed in a blur of questions, explanations, and paperwork. Snoop detailed the events step by step, careful to emphasize that he had only acted in self-defense. Beverly backed up his account, and the video provided the evidence they needed. But even as the officers assured them they would investigate the bikers and issue warrants for their arrests, Snoop couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. When the police finally left, Snoop and Beverly climbed back into the car. The gas tank was full, but neither of them felt ready to hit the road just yet. "You think they'll come back?" Beverly asked, her voice quieter now. Snoop stared out the window, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not taking any chances." They drove in silence for a while, the tension lingering between them. The highway was darker now, the only lights coming from the occasional passing car or distant street lamp. Beverly finally broke the silence. "You know, this isn't the first time I've been scared like that," she said, her voice soft but steady. Snoop glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away, as if deciding how much to share. Finally, she sighed. "When you were little, we didn't have much. There were times I had to stand up to people just to keep food on the table. I thought those days were behind me." Snoop felt a pang of guilt. "I should have done more to keep you safe back there." "You did plenty," she said firmly, "but this isn't just about us. It's about what people still think they can get away with." He nodded, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Not anymore." They pulled into the parking lot of a small motel a few miles down the road. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a red glow over the cracked asphalt. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. As Snoop killed the engine, he noticed a dark van parked near the edge of the lot. Its windows were tinted, and it didn't have any markings, but something about it felt off. "You go on inside," Snoop said, handing Beverly the keys. "I'll be right there." She hesitated but didn't argue, disappearing into the motel lobby while Snoop lingered outside. He walked slowly toward the van, pretending to check his phone as he moved. The closer he got, the clearer the feeling became. He was being watched. He could feel it in the way the air seemed heavier, the way the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Suddenly, the van's engine roared to life and it peeled out of the lot, tires screeching against the pavement. Snoop watched it go, his chest tight with frustration. When he finally went inside, Beverly was waiting in their room, already settled on one of the beds. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he lied, "just making sure." But as he lay down that night, Snoop couldn't sleep. The day's events replayed in his mind, each moment sharpening his determination. The bikers weren't just some random group looking for trouble. They had picked him and his mother for a reason, and they weren't going to stop until someone made them. Snoop closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Tomorrow he would start making calls, lawyers, media contacts, activists, whatever it took. Because this wasn't just about defending himself anymore. This was about sending a message, one that no one could ignore. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting faint patterns on the worn carpet. Snoop Dogg sat at the small desk by the window, his phone pressed to his ear as he scrolled through messages and news updates. Beverly lay on the bed behind him, her breathing steady but shallow, as if even in sleep she couldn't fully relax. Snoop hadn't slept much either. The events of the previous day looped through his mind. The bikers' snarling faces, the feel of adrenaline in his veins, the weight of knowing it wasn't over. He had spent half the night replaying the footage Beverly had recorded, pausing and rewinding, searching for any detail they might have missed. Now, as the sun began to rise, he was already making calls. "No, man, I don't care what it takes," he said into the phone, his voice low but urgent. "I need those plates tracked down, that van too. And put the video out there, everywhere. I want people to see this." The person on the other end said something reassuring, but Snoop didn't relax. He ended the call and leaned back in the chair, rubbing his temples. Behind him, Beverly stirred. "Calvin?" He turned. "Morning, Mama. You sleep okay?" She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back. "Better than you, by the look of it. You've been up all night, haven't you?" "I had to make some calls," he admitted. "This thing isn't going away. We need to stay ahead of it." Beverly stood and walked over to him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I know you're trying to protect me, but don't let this eat you up inside. We're still here. We're still safe. For now," Snoop said, his voice tight. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. So what's the plan?" "The cops said they'd investigate," Snoop said, "but you know how slow that can be. I'm not waiting around for them to decide whether this is important enough to follow through on." He picked up his phone again, scrolling through his contacts. "I've already got my people spreading the video. We'll make sure everyone sees it. Media, activists, lawyers. And I'm calling in favors to make sure we've got the best legal team ready." Beverly crossed her arms. "And what about us? Do we just keep running while we wait for them to come after us again?" Snoop's jaw tightened. "No, we're not running. Not anymore." By noon, the video had already started gaining traction online. Social media exploded with reactions, outrage, support, and the usual wave of trolls trying to discredit them. Beverly scrolled through comments as they sat in a booth at a nearby diner. The greasy smell of frying bacon and eggs lingered in the air, but neither of them had much appetite. "Some people still don't believe it," Beverly said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "They're calling it staged." Snoop nodded, unsurprised. "They always do. Doesn't matter what proof you give them." A man at a nearby table kept glancing over, and Snoop felt his muscles tense again. He didn't know if the man recognized him or if he was just another local sizing up the outsiders. Either way, Snoop didn't like it. When the waitress brought their check, Beverly reached for her purse, but Snoop waved her off and threw some cash on the table. "Let's get out of here," he said. Outside, the heat pressed down on them as they walked to the car. Snoop scanned the parking lot, his eyes lingering on a black SUV parked near the entrance. It wasn't the van from last night, but something about it felt too familiar. They climbed into the car, and Snoop wasted no time pulling out of the lot. Beverly didn't say anything, but he could feel her watching him, sensing his tension. "You think they're following us?" she finally asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not taking any chances." They drove in silence for a while, the road stretching out ahead of them. Eventually, Beverly reached over and turned on the radio, trying to break the tension. A news report came on, coverage of the video. The footage shows a physical altercation between the well-known rapper and a group of bikers at a gas station, raising questions about racial tensions in rural communities. Snoop turned it off. "We already know what happened," he said. Beverly frowned. "People need to hear it. They need to know what's still going on out here." "They will," Snoop said, "but not like this. I'm not letting them turn this into just another story. We're gonna do this the right way." That night, they checked into another motel. This one was slightly nicer, but the unease hadn't left them. Snoop sat by the window, watching the parking lot. Beverly sat across from him, folding and unfolding the map they'd picked up earlier. "You're thinking too much again," she said. "I can't help it." She set the map down and looked at him. "You can't fight everything, Calvin. Sometimes you have to let people step up and fight with you." He hesitated, then nodded. "I just don't want to let them down." "You won't," Beverly said. Before either of them could say more, Snoop's phone buzzed. It was one of his contacts. "We got IDs on the bikers," the voice said, "and you're not gonna like what we found." Snoop felt his stomach drop. "What is it?" "They're part of a group that's been linked to several attacks like this. Most of them never made the news. And get this, they've got cops in their pockets." Snoop closed his eyes, the weight of the words settling over him. "Thanks," he said, ending the call. Beverly was already watching him, waiting. "What is it?" He opened his eyes and met hers. "It's bigger than we thought." For the first time, he saw real fear in her expression, but he also saw something else, determination. "Then we fight," she said. Snoop nodded. "Yeah, we fight." The night stretched on as they made plans, but Snoop knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The tension was boiling over, and they were right in the middle of it. Tomorrow, the battle would truly begin. The next morning broke with a gray sky, clouds thickening above the horizon like the weight pressing down on Snoop's chest. He stood outside the motel room, leaning against the railing and staring out at the nearly empty parking lot. His phone buzzed in his hand, but he ignored it for now. Too many calls, too many messages. Everyone had an opinion. Lawyers offering advice, reporters requesting interviews, activists reaching out in solidarity. But none of it mattered if the men who attacked his mother weren't held accountable. Inside the room, Beverly packed her things in silence. She moved slowly, her motions careful and deliberate, but Snoop could tell she wasn't herself. The events of the past 2 days had taken their toll. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, stepping back inside. She looked up at him and straightened. "I've been ready my whole life, Calvin. This isn't new to me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Snoop nodded, though his stomach twisted. He hated seeing her like this, resilient but worn. She deserved better. The phone buzzed again. This time, Snoop answered. "Yeah?" "It's me," said Marcus, his longtime friend and business associate. "I got the press lined up. They're already sharing the video, but they want to hear your side. I'm talking national coverage, man. This could blow up even bigger." Snoop pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'm not looking for fame off this, Marcus. It's not about fame. It's about making sure no one forgets what happened. You know how these stories disappear unless we keep pushing." Snoop exhaled. "Set it up." 2 hours later, they were sitting in a downtown law office. The building smelled of fresh paint and polished wood, but it felt sterile, cold and unwelcoming. Snoop tapped his fingers against the conference table, his eyes scanning the faces of the legal team assembled before him. "These guys aren't just random punks," one of the lawyers said, sliding a file across the table. "They're part of an organized group, connections to white nationalist movements, ties to local authorities. And this isn't their first incident." Beverly leaned forward. "So, what happens now?" "We filed charges," the lawyer said. "Assault, harassment, intent to cause bodily harm. But that's just the beginning. The video gives us leverage, but we need to build a stronger case if we want this to stick." Snoop folded his arms. "And what about protection? These guys aren't just going to sit back and let this happen." The lawyer hesitated. "We'll request additional security measures, but the truth is we can't guarantee anything. Cases like this, they tend to get messy." Snoop felt the anger simmering beneath his skin. "Then we make sure it doesn't." Later that evening, they stood in front of a small crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in their faces, and the hum of reporters asking questions buzzed in the air. Snoop stepped forward, holding up a hand to quiet them. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming out," he began, "but I'm not here to talk about me. This is about my mother, about every mother, every father, every son and daughter who's ever had to face hate and violence just for being who they are." The crowd murmured in agreement. Beverly stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm for support. "This ain't just about what happened at that gas station," Snoop continued. "It's about a system that lets people like those bikers think they can get away with it. And it's about making sure that stops, today." The applause was loud, but Snoop barely heard it. He was already thinking ahead, about the hearings, the media frenzy, and the backlash that was sure to come. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and legal preparations. Snoop felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, but he refused to let it show. Beverly, too, refused to waver, though Snoop could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Protests began to form outside the courthouse, both in support of their case and against it. Signs bearing hateful messages popped up alongside banners calling for justice. News crews swarmed the area, capturing every moment. One evening, as Snoop and Beverly returned to their motel, they found a threatening note slipped under the door. "Drop the charges or else." Beverly stared at the paper, her hands trembling slightly. What does this mean?" "It means they're scared," Snoop said, crumpling the note. "And they should be." But he couldn't deny the knot of fear tightening in his gut. He knew these men wouldn't stop. They'd already proven that. 2 nights later, someone slashed the tires of their car. The police were called, but the officers who arrived seemed indifferent, taking notes without much urgency. "We'll look into it," one of them said before walking away. Beverly sat on the edge of the motel bed, her head in her hands. "What if they don't stop, Calvin? What if this just gets worse?" Snoop knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Then we keep fighting, no matter what." She looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm proud of you. You know that?" He swallowed hard. "I'm proud of you too, Mama." The next day, the legal team filed the charges. The bikers were arrested, though 2 of them made bail almost immediately. The news set off another wave of protests, and Snoop knew things were about to get even more complicated. But he also knew they were too far in to back down now. As he and Beverly walked into the courthouse for the first hearing, he squeezed her hand and gave her a reassuring nod. "No matter what happens," he said, "we're not doing this alone." She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. And as the doors swung shut behind them, Snoop took a deep breath. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. The courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, its stone walls weathered, its columns imposing. Cameras lined the steps leading to the entrance, their lenses turning as Snoop and Beverly approached. Protesters filled the sidewalks, their voices clashing in chants, slogans, and shouts that blurred into a cacophony of anger and defiance. Some held signs demanding justice, while others carried banners spewing hate and resistance. Snoop adjusted the cuffs of his suit, but his hands betrayed his tension, tightening into fists at his sides. Beverly walked beside him, her head high despite the weight pressing down on both of them. She wore a simple dress, understated yet elegant, but it was her expression that drew attention. Calm, resolute, and unflinching. Reporters swarmed as soon as they reached the steps. "Snoop, do you think the charges will stick?" "Beverly, are you afraid for your safety?" "What message do you hope this trial sends?" Snoop ignored them, guiding Beverly toward the entrance. He wasn't here for sound bites. He was here for justice. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The rows of benches were packed, supporters, journalists, and curious onlookers jostling for position. At the front, the bikers sat at the defendant's table, their leather jackets replaced with suits that didn't quite fit. They looked out of place, uncomfortable, but their eyes still carried the same defiance as before. Snoop locked eyes with one of them, the tall one who had started the fight at the gas station. The man smirked, a silent challenge, and Snoop felt his anger flare, but Beverly's hand on his arm grounded him. "Stay focused," she whispered. He nodded. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "This court is now in session." The prosecution opened with the video footage. The screen flickered to life, showing the bikers surrounding Beverly, their words sharp and cutting even through the grainy recording. Gasps rippled through the room as the confrontation escalated, culminating in the physical assault and Snoop's intervention. The prosecutor paused the video, letting the silence hang before addressing the jury. "This is not an isolated incident," she said. "This is part of a pattern of intimidation, harassment, and violence. And today, we're here to put an end to it." The defense countered, claiming self-defense. They felt threatened, the defense attorney argued, pacing in front of the jury. They were outnumbered and feared for their safety. This was not a hate crime. It was a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. Snoop's blood boiled, but he kept his composure. He knew this was coming. He had prepared for it. Witnesses took the stand one by one. The gas station clerk described what he saw, the bikers crowding Beverly, Snoop stepping in to protect her. But, under cross-examination, the defense chipped away at his credibility, pointing out inconsistencies and implying he might have been biased by Snoop's celebrity status. Beverly testified next. She spoke with a calmness that silenced the room, her voice steady as she recounted the fear she had felt, but also her determination not to back down. "They didn't see me as a person," she said. "They saw me as something less. And that's why we're here today." The defense tried to rattle her, questioning her memory and motives, but Beverly didn't flinch. When they implied she had exaggerated the threat, she looked the lawyer straight in the eye. "Would you have done the same if it was your mother?" The question hung in the air and the lawyer faltered. Snoop took the stand last. He spoke about his upbringing, the struggles his mother faced raising him, and the lessons she taught him about standing up for what's right. "I didn't want to fight," he said. "I wanted to protect my mother. And I'd do it again if I had to." The defense tried to paint him as aggressive, bringing up lyrics from his past songs and questioning whether his fame had influenced his actions. "I make music about the world I grew up in," Snoop replied, "and that world didn't change just because I got famous." As the trial progressed, tensions outside the courthouse continued to rise. Protesters clashed, police struggled to keep order, and threats poured in online. Beverly refused to be intimidated. She continued speaking to the press, sharing her story and calling for change. "This isn't just about us," she said during one interview. "It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." Her words resonated and support grew. Celebrities, activists, and politicians began to speak out, adding to the pressure. But the bikers' supporters fought back just as hard. They spread misinformation, twisted the narrative, and tried to discredit Beverly and Snoop. The weight of it all bore down on Snoop, but he refused to let it break him. The closing arguments were a battle of ideals. The prosecution emphasized the evidence, the video, the testimonies, the history of the bikers group. "This is not just about one night," the prosecutor said. "It's about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we let hate and fear win, or do we stand up and say, 'No more'?" The defense leaned on fear. "These men are not monsters," the defense attorney said. "They made a mistake. Don't let one moment define their lives." Snoop clenched his fists. "A mistake? That's all it was to them." The jury deliberated for hours, and every second felt like an eternity. Snoop paced the waiting room, Beverly sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap. "You think they'll see the truth?" she asked. "They have to," Snoop said, but he wasn't sure if he believed it. Finally, the bailiff called them back in. The jury had reached a verdict. The room was silent as the foreman stood. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendants guilty." A wave of relief washed over Snoop, but he didn't celebrate. Not yet. The judge handed down the sentence: prison time for some, mandatory community service, and anti-bias training for others. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step. As they left the courtroom, Snoop took Beverly's hand. "It's not over," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it's a start." And as they walked down the courthouse steps, past the cameras and the crowds, Snoop felt something he hadn't felt in days: hope. The courthouse steps were quieter now. The reporters had dispersed, the protesters had gone home, and the roar of the crowd had faded into memory. Snoop and Beverly stood at the top of the steps, looking out over the empty plaza. The trial was over. The verdict had been read. Justice, in some form, had been served, but neither of them felt like celebrating. The weight of the last few weeks still hung heavy in the air. The sleepless nights, the threats, the endless questions, it had all left scars that wouldn't heal overnight. Beverly gripped Snoop's arm as they made their way down the steps, her pace steady but slow. "You sure you're okay, Mama?" Snoop asked, his voice soft. She looked up at him and smiled faintly. "I'm tired, Calvin, but I'm okay." It was a simple answer, but Snoop heard the exhaustion behind it. This fight had taken its toll on her, on both of them. And yet, there was something else in her voice, a quiet strength that hadn't been broken. As they reached the car, Snoop paused, glancing back at the courthouse one last time. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had endured and everything they still had to fight for. "This ain't the end," he said, more to himself than to Beverly. "No," she agreed, "it's just the beginning." The next few weeks passed in a blur of interviews, meetings, and planning sessions. The case had ignited a national conversation, and Snoop was determined to keep the momentum going. He knew the verdict wasn't enough. Real change required more than a single courtroom victory. He started by reaching out to community leaders, activists, and educators. Together, they began drafting proposals for new initiatives, programs aimed at addressing racism, promoting tolerance, and educating young people about equality and justice. Beverly was right there with him. She spoke at town halls and schools, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak out against hate. Her voice became a rallying cry for change, and people listened. One afternoon, they stood outside a community center in South Los Angeles, watching as volunteers set up tables and booths for a neighborhood event. Kids ran through the parking lot, their laughter echoing off the walls. Parents chatted in small groups, some holding signs that read, "Unity over hate." "This is what it's about," Beverly said, watching the scene unfold. Snoop nodded. "Yeah, but it's just the start." The first program they launched focused on education. Partnering with local schools, they developed workshops and seminars designed to teach students about the history of racism in America and the importance of empathy and inclusion. Beverly insisted on being involved every step of the way, sharing her own experiences and encouraging students to open up about theirs. At one session, a young girl raised her hand and asked Beverly how she stayed so strong. "It's not about never being scared," Beverly said. "It's about what you do with that fear. You can let it stop you, or you can let it push you to do something good." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with determination. But not everyone welcomed the changes. There were protests outside some of the events, angry voices shouting that they were stirring up trouble and dividing the country. Threatening messages continued to arrive, some targeting Snoop, others aimed at Beverly. Snoop refused to back down. He increased security at the events and kept pushing forward, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Late one night, he sat in his office scrolling through messages and news updates. Beverly walked in, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You need to rest," she said, setting one down in front of him. "I can't," he replied. "Not yet." She sat down across from him. "You're not going to fix everything overnight, Calvin. Change takes time." "I know," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But what if it's not enough? What if—" "Stop," Beverly interrupted. "Look at what you've already done. Look at what we've done. That's more than enough to keep going." Snoop stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right," she smiled. "I usually am." The next milestone came 6 months later when they opened the first Justice and Unity Center in Los Angeles. The building was a converted warehouse, transformed into a space for workshops, counseling, and community meetings. Murals covered the walls, images of unity, strength, and hope. At the grand opening, Snoop stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. Beverly stood beside him, her presence grounding him as always. "This center isn't just a building," Snoop said. "It's a promise that we're not gonna let hate win. Not here. Not anywhere." The applause was deafening, but Snoop barely heard it. He was already thinking about the next step, the next city, the next program. Over time, the center became more than just a resource. It became a symbol. People traveled from across the country to visit, to learn, to share their stories. The programs expanded, reaching schools, prisons, and corporations. Celebrities and politicians lent their support, and the movement continued to grow. Beverly remained at the heart of it all. She became a mentor to young activists, a voice of wisdom and encouragement. One day, as she and Snoop walked through the center, she stopped to admire one of the murals. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an image of a tree with roots intertwining beneath the surface. "That's what we're building here, roots, something that lasts." Snoop smiled. "You're right again, Mama." Years later, Snoop stood on a stage at another rally, this time in Washington, D.C. Beverly sat in the front row, her hair grayer now, but her eyes as sharp as ever. As he spoke to the crowd, he thought back to that night at the gas station. The fear, the anger, the determination to fight back. "We started this because we had to," he said. "But we kept going because we knew we weren't alone. And we're not done yet." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Snoop's gaze went straight to Beverly. She smiled at him, her pride shining brighter than ever. And in that moment, Snoop knew that no matter how long the fight continued, they had already changed the world. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. And check out our other stories for more powerful and thought-provoking content.